Welcome to the University of Toronto Joint Center for Bioethics Seminar Series. I'm Angel Petropanagos, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our speakers today are Melissa McCradden, James Anderson, and Elizabeth Stevenson, and their seminar is entitled AI Evidence in Ethics, a Pathway for Clinical Translation. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to let you know that the seminar is being recorded. This lecture, along with other archived lectures, can be accessed through the Joint Center for Bioethics website. The format of our seminar is a presentation by our speakers, followed by a facilitated discussion period. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also stand in solidarity with the ongoing protests against racism and systemic discrimination. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Melissa McCradden is a bioethicist at the Hospital for Sick Children and an assistant professor with the Division of Clinical and Public Health at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health. She holds a PhD in neuroscience from McMaster University, a master's in bioethics from the University of Toronto. She was the inaugural postdoctoral fellow in ethics of AI in healthcare, a joint venture between Sick Kids and the Vector Institute. She's a member of the Consort and Spirit AI Working Group for reporting guidelines for AI healthcare trials. Her research focuses on the ethics of healthcare, AI, and precision medicine, including explainability, bias, and social justice, the research ethics of evaluating AI interventions. She is a co-director of the Empirical Bioethics course in the Masters of Health Science program in Bioethics at the Joint Center for Bioethics at U of T. James Anderson is a bioethicist in the bioethics department, an assistant professor in the Institute for Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto, and a member of the Joint Center for Bioethics. In his role, James provides bioethics consultation, policy analysis, bioethics education, and conducts research. Since 2013, James has directed a course in ethical theory in the Masters of Health Scientists in Bioethics program at the Joint Center for Bioethics. His research explores the intersection of ethics, epistemology, and clinical research and practice. Recent work has focused on ML applications in healthcare, whole genome sequencing, and clinical decision-making in pediatrics. And Dr. Elizabeth Stevenson is a professor at the University of Toronto and section head of cardiac electrophysiology at the Hospital for Sick Children. Her undergraduate degree was done at Mount Holyoke College, where she graduated with honors in biology and high honors in philosophy, with a focus on medical ethics in the pediatric population. She received her MD from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and her Master's of Science in Clinical Epidemiology from the University of Toronto. Her pediatric residency, cardiology fellowship, and electrophysiology fellowships were all done at Children's Hospital in Boston. Dr. Stevenson's research work in electrophysiology has focused on clinical investigations, centered on several topics in the field of electrophysiology and heart function, particularly as related to pediatric use of pacemakers, cardiac resynchronization therapy, and implantable cardioverter defibrillators. She has been a member of the Sick Kids REB since 2007 and the Sick Kids Research Ethics Board Chair since January 2015. Okay. So I will turn it over to you now, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Angel, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today presenting with Beth and James this project. It actually started off as my capstone project for my master's degree. James was my supervisor and Beth was my advisor, and I'm really excited to share the work that we've done, and really proud of our successful translation pathway. So just with respect to disclosures, we have no conflicts of interest to disclose, but as Angel mentioned in my introduction, I'm a member of the Spirit and Consort working groups, and we'll be presenting some of that work today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Beth to tell you a little bit about how this project actually got started.
Thanks so much, Melissa and Angel. It's great to be talking with everyone today. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background on sort of how we got to this point. We've been hearing for quite some time about requests for access to data for machine learning projects, and there really wasn't a clear process in the hospital to help the investigators actually get to this data. Many of the investigators were quite frustrated at the lack of progress on this front, and they really just didn't know how to move forward. They wanted to just get to the data and get to work. We also knew that many of them were unfamiliar with the research approval process, often because many of the team members didn't come from a clinical research background and didn't know about research ethics and the whole very wide variety of research that we have oversight for. And this really reflected, for the most part, a genuine uncertainty about whether the development and translation of these models really was ultimately research. We did find very strong agreement across all the groups that ML required oversight, rigorous evaluation, but whether or not the REB framework was the right approach was not initially obvious to everyone. So we identified a group of people with expertise in QI, research ethics, bioethics, as well as a large number of ML researchers here at the hospital to try and think through this and decide what our process should be and give all of these researchers a clear path forward so that they could get their data and move on with their work. And James is now going to take us through that development.
Thanks so much, Beth. So as that sort of problem scenario suggests, we were genuinely challenged by trying to figure out whether ML should be considered research or quality improvement or perhaps something else. And, you know, for one among many reasons is answering that question would help determine what framework for oversight was appropriate. Next slide, please. I guess I should just point out QI, as most of you already know, if not all of you, is typically exempt from from independent ethics review. There are various processes in place in different institutions for reviewing QI, in some cases none at all, but it's typically, I will say, less burdensome, let's put it that way. It's a fairly negative way of characterizing it, but that's meant to be appropriate given the lower level of risk involved typically. Okay, so sorry, I went backwards there. So exploring that question, what's the appropriate framework, led immediately to considerations around, you know, what is research, what is QI? Research is defined within US regulations, in the Belmont Report and in the Common Federal Rule. This definition turns on generalizability, right? So research is defined as a systematic investigation, you know, designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. In Canada, we started with a definition like that, but the second edition of the TCPS dropped generalizability, primarily, as I understand it, to make room for qualitative research. And so now we have a definition like this to extend knowledge through disciplined inquiry. Next slide, please. Quality improvement, by contrast, there's many definitions. Here's one: systematic data-guided activities designed to bring about immediate positive changes in the delivery of healthcare in particular settings. Crucially, in particular settings, so again, that's meant to contrast with the generalizability criterion that quality improvement is typically local in nature. QI projects are not universally low in risk, however. They're not exempt from requiring informed consent, certainly not in all cases. They certainly can be quite important and impactful. And these studies are published can be published in the academic literature. For our purposes, I think the crucial bit here is that it's designed to optimize the delivery of established clinical interventions. And so this is the ethical justification for relatively lower oversight of QI activities is that the intervention itself is already known to be in the patient's best interests, and we're typically comparing one of those with another one itself known to be in the patient's best interest, for example. Okay, next slide, please. So is ML development QI? I think there are features of ML that immediately suggest this. So it's not typically, ML models are not typically generalizable. They're highly context sensitive. So that's a key feature. They're typically intended to sometimes intended to optimize the care of individuals, right? So that has a QI flavor. It's validated often through an iterative process instead of a kind of strict protocolized approach that we find in most clinical research. And the models don't typically change the interventions themselves. So if you contrast that with a drug study where we're studying the intervention itself, ML models don't typically intervene directly in that way, though they may modify the delivery of interventions in various ways, and often are believed to be low risk. Okay, so next slide, please. Or let's consider whether, what features of ML models or ML work are consistent with the research paradigm. So certainly even though the model itself or the models themselves might not be generalizable, the approach to model development may be, right? The work that ML researchers, if I can put it that way, it sounds question begging in this context, certainly involves systematic inquiry. The models or model use doesn't involve a deviation from standard practice, to varying degrees. And though models themselves don't typically change or directly change the intervention, they certainly can change, the pathway or the timing or various other aspects of care, and that's important. And that's the next point there. May prompt a patient to receive an intervention they may not otherwise receive. It's an example. And it can present novel or unforeseen risks, both direct and indirect. And so one of the ones that's certainly been discussed a great deal in the literature is in relation to bias and scalability. So if a model is based on a biased data set and is scaled up because these models can be quite easily scalable by comparison to other sorts of interventions, those risks can be spread across a fairly large population fairly quickly, and that's a major concern with these models. Next slide, please. Oh, give me a second. So these considerations are, I think, from an ethics point of view, exacerbated to some extent by what has come to be called the AI chasm. This was a term coined by Topol and Keene, and it's essentially the gap between performance in a historical data set and performance in actual clinical practice in this context, so real-time performance. So typically when a model is developed, it's in a curated data set that's been pre-processed and cleaned based on completed patient encounters. And so it really represents a kind of proxy picture of how it would actually work in a clinical environment. And though ML can attain a very high accuracy in that curated data set, this often doesn't translate into real-time performance in large part or in part because we have, in live data streams, the data is interrupted, incomplete. There's all kinds of perturbations and conditions that are different from the historical test set. And so these can create what is called the AI chasm. And so next slide, please. So all of this, I think, led us, and I think has led others to conclude that predictive accuracy alone is not sufficient to give us license and to guide the use of ML models in clinical practice, or the introduction of ML models in clinical practice. If you're a clinician and someone gives you a drug and says it's very effective for diabetes, you still require a lot of additional information to know how to use that drug, right? What is this is an analogy, but what is the correct dosage? When is the appropriate time to use that in the course of disease, et cetera. So there's a lot of additional information that is needed. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, predictive accuracy does not translate directly into justified claims of patient benefit. And given our duty of care to patients, prospective clinical research is needed to justify the introduction of ML models into clinical practice. and clinical research is subject to REB oversight. So I think this is the starting point for the development of our pathway, and I'll pass it over to Melissa at this point.
Thanks, James. So we hypothesized that clinical research could play a key role in helping to cross this chasm because it's done so for other interventions within healthcare. And so we recently published our pathway and are currently working on a larger paper describing the fulsome ethical justifications that go into each step of this pathway. And so it's roughly divided into 3 parts. So in the first part, we're doing exploratory machine learning research. And this is where researchers are asking questions like, what can be done with this data? What relationships are apparent? What tasks can machine learning perform? And once you find a model that seems to perform well in the historical context, and you may be discussing with a clinician and thinking that this model has potential clinical applicability, the next step then is to evaluate it during a silent period. And so here we're asking questions like, does the model have clinical applicability? This is a hypothesis that we're testing. Can it address a clinical task? And is it feasible to actually implement this at scale? The third step there is prospective clinical evaluation. So this is where we're asking, does the use of this model benefit patients, and which patients, and under what conditions? So the first stage, really going back to what Beth had described as sort of our problem statement, was the first step required access to data. And so under the TCP/S2 and many other frameworks, there's the provision for secondary use of data. So it generally refers to the retrieval of data that was originally collected for clinical purposes, which does not necessarily require consent if it is unfeasible to obtain consent for each individual and it's sufficiently low risk. Now, that being said, we do have several data sets that are consented, such as imaging data sets, where now patients, as part of their consent form, will typically indicate whether they consent to the use of their images for research. So one of the main changes that was made to the way that you would typically apply for secondary use of data was with respect to the scope of the application. So for starters, groups at our hospital were allowed to apply on a group basis rather than a specific project basis. And the reason for this was because one of the key parts of doing machine learning requires a wide variety of data and testing different models, testing different uses of data, testing different data sources. And it requires a lot of leeway. And we felt that this was justified because one of the things that I've come to understand, particularly from my colleagues in machine learning, is that it avoids a lot of the conditions under which a machine learning researcher might bias themselves in trying to develop a model directed toward a pre-specified goal. And so in allowing this sort of access, which, colloquially, we heard terms like fishing expedition thrown out at the beginning, and it can seem like that. However, it is based on a genuine effort to try and avoid arriving at a pre-specified conclusion. And because researchers genuinely don't know at the outset what sources of data will be important and which ones won't. And as an example of that, one of the models that was being developed was doing quite well for some time, and the researchers had tried to minimize the amount of PHI that they were using. And so they hadn't collected visit date. And when they had a next batch of data retrieval, they found that the model's performance dropped off unexpectedly. And one of the clinicians pointed out that there was actually a change at the hospital in terms of how they dealt with these patients. And so the researchers actually had to do a new data pull, including the visit date, to be able to correct for this, to develop the model in accordance with this new policy shift. So it highlights the need for this more iterative approach to data access, but also that strict minimization of PHI use in some cases can end up with the researcher not having access to data that's crucial for their model development, and can also result in them having to go back to reapply. So one of the things that we came up with for our access protocols was to create tiered data sets, because there are certain cases in which you will not need visit date. You will not need, the approximate age of the patient. You will not need certain forms. And this is particularly helpful if you're just starting to explore certain data sources or if there are student-led projects. And so the PI ultimately is accountable for determining which individuals have access to the different tiered data sets. And access is provided to groups on the basis of having completed TCPS2 training and the required privacy modules at SickKids. And the other point was that we allowed for a high frequency of retrievals because it is necessary to continue adjusting to the shifting patient trends that more closely approximate the conditions in which you would use this model in a clinical environment. So if we had data access every 3 months, it would be quite a significant shift to try and redevelop the model according to those conditions. Now, I always like to stress here that I think Effie Viena and Alessandra Blasame have made this really important point that there are many ways in which we get access to data as researchers, some consented, some non-consented, some through learning healthcare systems, other through this type of protocol. And they really stress that there are additional ethical responsibilities to the research participants. So informing patients about how their data is being used, involving them in the process, involving them in giving input to research priorities and things like that. And so I think this is an institutional issue that I know we're working quite hard on at SickKids. So again, to kind of go back to some of the points that were stressed earlier, models can demonstrate really great performance in the training and testing set in a historical context and really do quite well. And then they hit the live data stream, and to some extent or other, they can flop. And this is not because the model has all of a sudden stopped doing well. It's by the very nature of the environments in which they're now trying to be deployed. As medicine is complex, we have missing data. We're at different stages within patient encounters. There's incomplete data. And so we have to figure out how to develop and evaluate a model's performance in this new complex environment. And so that was where this idea of the silent period came in. And so this publication from Jenna Waynes and colleagues really introduces this concept because it was machine learning researchers who recognized that this performance in an historical set is not good enough and there needs to be an additional validation period. And so they had proposed that the model could be run in silent mode. So you have the model essentially simulating how it would be integrated in a clinical workflow, making predictions in real time, but those predictions are not visible to the treating team, so they're not influencing care decisions. And ultimately, we felt this is extended further because now at this point, we're actually testing a hypothesis. Again, to kind of stress that this is fundamentally a research question, we're testing the hypothesis that this model has clinical applicability so that the performance is retained in the live environment. And so this stage, the protocols at this stage actually have two parallel but related objectives. So the model itself, there's a certain amount of calibration that needs to happen, some amount of redevelopment, and it depends on the type of model, how much is required, but really you're adjusting your model to this new semi-new environment to really make sure that it's going to perform well under the conditions in which it's expected to perform a certain clinical task. And then the second set is the research goal. So this is where you're looking at the predictions and it allows you to hypothesize what could happen if the clinician had access to that information at that point in the clinical pathway. And so this, again, to go back to the iterative nature of some of these protocols, the silent trial really allows researchers to think about this and clinicians as well, and to try and sort out what would be the best place to position this model to effectuate a beneficial outcome. And so the ethics related goal at this stage, we've said, is toward equipoise. So we know that performance in an historical data set is not sufficient justification to proceed with implementation, but nor is it as well to proceed with interventional research. We first have to meet the condition of equipoise. And so the silent trial can establish clinical equipoise. According to Friedman, this was the traditional justification for conducting a prospective clinical trial. and it reflects the state of genuine uncertainty among a community of experts about whether the model has the potential to exceed the current standard of care. And so it's important to know also that this is also not quite enough justification for full translation either, because we haven't actually yet evaluated the effect of the model itself as an intervention within the care pathway. We've only looked at the predictions, looked at the patient outcome, and hypothesized about what effect might be there were we to use that prediction. And so to test what actually happens as a result of using those predictions, we need prospective clinical evaluation. So this is where we're testing the hypothesis that the model as an intervention results in a net benefit to patients. And so through this process, we're contributing to the field of medicine generally with the demonstration of machine learning as an approach that can improve a given outcome for patients. And so I really love the way that Jenna Waynes has stated this in terms of, she describes that you can have a generalizable approach, not always a generalizable model. And this is still kind of a point of debate within the machine learning community. But what she means to say here is that given certain inputs and the application of certain architecture of a model directed toward a particular clinical task, that approach can be taken up by a peer institution in the hopes of achieving a similar outcome for their patients. And so this is actually the first stage where we're looking at clinically relevant evaluation. So a patient-centered outcome, some sort of benefit that we're trying to hope to gain by the use of the machine learning model. And this, again, is something that we haven't yet done with either the silent trial or the exploratory machine learning work. And so when we think about how to integrate this into evidence-based medicine, we've sort of thought through what the pyramid of evidence looks like for these different studies. And so at this bottom level, we have retrospective studies. So this is the exploratory modeling. And so they can generate some theoretical plausibility that a certain outcome can be predicted using machine learning. At the next stage, we have observational studies. So for example, the silent trial is a non-interventional prospective study, which can't necessarily establish facts about the model's impact on patient outcomes, but it can provide evidence regarding the clinical utility of the intervention itself. At the next stage, we have quasi-randomized studies. So this is where we might be looking at quasi-randomization or stepped wedge trials. And so here you can estimate causal effects in this data. So they are a bit more prone to bias than your traditional RCT, which of course are at the highest level of the evidentiary pyramid, because with the use of randomization, we can try to control for potential confounders that might mask the effect of the model's performance in a clinical environment. And so some of our research colleagues who have really been starting down this pathway have also stressed that pilot studies can be really, really helpful. So even beyond the silent trial, sometimes moving direct to a clinical trial may be too big of a jump. And so pilot studies can bridge that gap. And I think, again, try and help sort out really what we're trying to establish is how can we best use this model? How can we best evaluate it to really make sure that it's going to work to benefit our patients? And so toward this goal, the Spirit and Consort AI initiative was established last year in 2019, which sought to take the current reporting standards or the reporting guidelines for clinical trials, interventional trials, and look at what are the things that we would need researchers to report on when involving an AI intervention. So these were recently published just September in Nature Medicine, Lancet Digital Health, and the BMJ. And one of the things that we've really found is, particularly at this early stage, where we're all really venturing into this territory of doing this prospective clinical evaluation. These guidelines are really helpful for setting up your research design and for writing up your protocol, so that you know that you've considered the elements in the design phase that are ultimately going to be required at the reporting phase. And so we'll talk a little bit later about some of the processes that we've set up within the RAB to try and help researchers toward this path to make it easier for them ultimately when they're then reporting on the results of their trial. And so I won't go into this in too much detail, but the process of developing these guidelines involved several rounds of Delphi consensus before meeting for a 2-day working group meeting in the UK back in January. And ultimately, we agreed on a number of new items. And I think it's important to kind of stress that, first of all, there are reporting requirements with respect to the data inputs and the processes that helped develop the algorithm that you're using, because another institution will need to know those as well. But then also the data concerning the population in which you tested this algorithm. So unlike other studies, those two can be quite different, and that's important to know. Second sort of theme that emerged from these new items was really with respect to making sure that we could get the most amount of details possible about how, where, and through what process the AI intervention was evaluated in the care pathway. So what did the interface look like? How were decisions made off of a particular prediction? How was it recorded what the ultimate choice from the patient was as a result of this prediction? And so those kinds of information are really, really critical when we consider that ultimately the goal of clinical trials is to inform evidence-based practice. So to come back to that EBM slide, we really have to figure out ultimately, how do we get the constellation of knowledge, of practices, and procedures that are necessary to really get a net benefit out of these machine learning models? And so it's more than just accuracy that we need to establish. We need to see, first of all, does this model have a beneficial effect over the current standard of care? What patients does it work well in? What patients does it not work as well in? When in the care pathway is it implemented? Because if you implement it later in the pathway at a different institution, you may end up with a different result through prospective evaluation. And so all of these things, I think, are very, very critical to making sure that the translation of these models is ultimately in a way that maximizes patient benefit. And so I'll turn it over to Beth to tell you a little bit about where we are now with respect to this pipeline at SickKids.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Yeah, so it's been a really exciting year, I think, as we've put all of this into practice. And of course, initially, all of our requests were for simple data access, looking at that first phase of research. And we found huge amounts of success with consultations with us prior to submission. So I can't even tell you how many are kind of underway because we're having so many conversations. But we have 12 that are formally under review, and we have multiple that are completely approved and underway collecting their data. We've built templates to help the research teams with the application process so that they know what we need from them, and they understand kind of why we're asking for the pieces of information that we are. So the templates are for each stage of research, and again, we're all developed in consultation with the ML researchers. We have several that are in submission that are going to be in their silent period, 5 that are currently under review, and 2 that are already approved and underway. And then we're starting to work with teams now for the prospective clinical evaluation phase. And as Melissa mentioned before, trying to work through pilot studies to help understand this process, I think will be very helpful. It's been a remarkable collaboration with the ML researchers that has really led to, I think, a fairly successful process on all sides.
Thanks, Beth. So just to kind of conclude our talk, I want to stress that closing this AI chasm is not just a technical matter. It's about integrating it integrating machine learning within these frameworks of evidence-based medical practice. And ultimately, I really think that prospective clinical evaluation can actually help resolve a lot of the central ethical challenges within AI in medicine. So including benefits and risks, exercise of clinical judgment, determining accountability, and machine learning assisted clinical decision-making. And again, just to stress, this pathway is a work in progress. There are several things that we're still working on. We're still learning from the teams who are actually doing this work. So I don't expect that this is, the last iteration of this process. There's still a lot of gains that we can make in going forward. And we're really learning a lot from our colleagues who are the ones who are really kind of leading the way. And just to bring us to our colleagues, these are just some of the individuals that we're incredibly grateful to. The AIM initiative has been so supportive of all of this work. Rose has handled, the lion's share of these consultations. Eric is our machine learning expert and has just been fantastic. And then three of the biggest teams that we've been working with are Devin Singh in the emergency department and Mandy Rickard, Lauren Erdman, Armando Lorenzo, and Marta Scrita from the urology team, in addition to the very large team at Lawson Labs. So we're really grateful to all of our colleagues who have taught us and we've helped get their projects moving forward. And so we're really excited for kind of seeing where we are another year from now. And so also thanks to the Spirit and Concert group, we recently launched the clinicaltrials.ai website, which is available. So again, it's really great to take a look at that. If anyone is looking to develop some of these protocols, this is a really great resource. So thank you so much. And we really look forward to your questions.
That's great. Melissa, James, and Beth, thank you so much for your presentation. So we're going to turn to the discussion period now. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can type your questions right in the chat box on YouTube, and we'll take them in turn as they come in. So our first question is from Les. They ask, how does the healthcare machine learning pipeline differ from the pipeline for drug approval?
That's a great question. So I think one of the issues that has yet to be sorted out is with respect to the regulatory approval. And I know there's active work going on at Health Canada with respect to this issue. And so I think that there may end up being differences with respect to solutions that are developed within an institution versus those that are developed outside. And so we really kind of have yet to see how things are progressing along those lines. But the way that we sort of saw it was that, clinical research has facilitated a number of beneficial applications in clinical practice, albeit with sometimes a significant gap. And I think one of the goals of a learning healthcare system is really to try and take advantage of rigorous knowledge when it's available to us and to implement into practice.
I might just expand on that to say that one of the things that we've done in setting up the REB process is to create an additional board with expertise around this, so that if Health Canada does decide to regulate this, and there is some discussion about software being used as a medical device, it's already something that's regulated, for example, in the pacemaker world, where the pacemaker software needs to be cleared. And if there is a movement towards that, our process of REB approval will be able to slot right into a regulatory approval framework.
Okay. So I'm wondering if you could say more about the board that you've put together and patient involvement in the creation of this REB process for machine learning.
I can take that. So we, for because we're following a formal framework, we will have science expertise as well as community representation, which for us on REB means either patients, former patients often, since most children are not going to be capable, but we'll often try recently graduated patients or their family members in order to make sure that that voice is heard, because of course that's an essential part of REB approval.
Yeah, I think just to elaborate on that as well, one of the lines that I mentioned in the presentation with respect to the additional ethical obligations on the part of institutions, one of them that I think is really important to move forward is with respect to how we involve patients in some of the overall approach to the use of personal health data. Some of my own research work has involved speaking with patients, with caregivers, and with members of the general public about what they think about health data use, and specifically with respect to AI. And I think that has it's shifted a little bit recently. Like you see this with some of the private sector scandals with Facebook and other companies like that. And so it's really kind of started to undermine the trust that people have. So when they hear AI, I think, one of the first things when we asked people what they thought about with AI was Terminator, which is not great. And then, the next most common is like Cambridge Analytica. So there's a real kind of issue with trust here. And so I think it is really important that we're involving patients. And one of the things that was a resounding statement that was made by just all across the board was that there is generally a lot of support for the use of data for research purposes. People really believe in this. However, they said again and again, I just want to know. I just want to know, just tell me what you're doing. I'm fine with it, but I want to know. And I think that that's kind of one of the biggest things that we should tackle, because even within, traditional research, we're not, there's a bit of that separation. And so I would really love to see, how we move forward in, first of all, informing patients about what we're doing, because we do believe that, we're doing everything that we can to benefit patients. And so we want them to know about those things. And then again, how to have their involvement in a more meaningful way as well.
Great, thanks. So our next question has a few parts to it. So they ask, first, what are your requirements for algorithmic transparency? And do you leave data grooming methods for missing data use? And then also they ask, what about testing crunch cases, using outlier cases to see what biases may be in place?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we have put some of those, hopefully, safeguards within our templates with the REB. So the first kind of concern that was identified was with respect to algorithmic transparency. And so I think, this is something that is, again, something that is hugely contentious. We have, examples from places like Google Health, where, you may not have access to the data or the model. You may have a subset of the code. And so there are concerns about transparency. And then even from a translation perspective, very often people want to know, how was this model developed? What went into it? How does it work? And I think that, those are they're really important questions. They're behind a lot of the work in explainability. But one of the kind of traditional aspects of clinical research is that it is possible for us to bring something to clinic that can benefit patients, even when we don't fully understand exactly how it works. So for example, many drugs, particularly antipsychotics or antidepressants, we don't fully understand how those work, but we do know that they do work for certain conditions. And so I think this is sort of an evolving conversation in machine learning as to how much you actually need to know about the model and where that stacks up. Because if we show that the use of this model in a workflow is benefiting patients, then that is, the transparency concerns kind of, may come secondary to the issue of patient benefit. And so the second question, I think, was likely getting at some of the issues with respect to monitoring model performance and subgroup specific performance, because this is where a lot of the issues about bias come in. So in our templates, we do have statements to this effect. And there's a number of frameworks that are out there right now that can help researchers actually, once they've developed a model, they can go through and start to monitor how this performance is actually mapping onto different subgroups. So for example, if you're looking at lung conditions generally, how does your model perform among patients with and without a chest tube? That can turn out to be critically important information. And so we have given some resources to researchers with respect to doing those kinds of checks. And there's ongoing work actually with respect to how to do algorithm audits that can help address some of these concerns.
Great, thanks. So our next question, they ask how we evaluate and validate health products or health applications or websites using the scorecard for patient use. So I'm not sure if that may be seeking some clarification on that, or if that's a comparison. Is there any? So maybe, so I think that question is from Gagandeep. Maybe if you can elaborate on that a bit more, and we can come back to it. Okay. And then we have a question asking to clarify whether stage 1 ML projects are reviewed at the REB.
So they are. All of the stages are coming through the REB at this point. The stage 1s are often hopefully eligible for a waiver of consent and evaluated under that framework, presuming that there's adequate data protection, but they are still evaluated with the traditional framework.
Okay. And we have a really great question about oversight, given that algorithmic decision-making is constantly evolving. So how does the oversight continue through the process?
So yeah, that's also a really great question and something that is really needed kind of going forward. I will say that at this stage, what we are talking about is locked algorithms. So a model is developed, it's then run on patient data. It's not, at this point anyway, continuously learning and changing off of that data. So we can update the model with a new batch of data later on. And again, you would have a similar process where you're monitoring the performance of that model. But we're not dealing yet with models that are just these kind of living systems that are continually changing. That may come down the line, and we do have to figure out what the right oversight process would be. And then again, I think that this would be subject to sort of the empirical evidence that is revealed about it. So you can kind of look at the different kinds of models that we might be talking about. So in an imaging database, for example, a model that is detecting whether a tumor is benign or malignant may not evolve so much over a substantial period of time. But when we're talking about, I mean, I didn't want to say the C word, but COVID is kind of a good example, where our knowledge is continually changing. And that's also the case with certain other diseases in medicine as well, where we might come to realize actually there's a certain clinical phenotype that doesn't fit the pattern of the overall, disease. And so we need a different process for that. And so how we kind of figured that out, again, the model performance has to be synchronized with the state of medical knowledge on the medical phenomenon that we are trying to assist with from the model perspective.
Okay, thanks. So our next question, supervised methods for machine learning say that the clinician remains the final decision maker. Do you see AI going unchecked? Or going AI unchecked, yeah.
I'll let you take that, Melissa. That's more along theoretical lines.
Yeah, I think what it ultimately comes down to is every clinician I talk to, their commitment to their patient is paramount. And if it were the case, so again, like to kind of go with another example here, clinicians might be able to see, like if you look at a patient who has a problem with their liver, they might be jaundiced. You can visually kind of spot that, and people might be varyingly accurate at how well they can detect that. But if you have a model, well, actually, you currently have a lab test that can tell you with pretty good accuracy whether a patient's liver is in trouble or not. You would never say something like, well, the clinician didn't think that their liver was in trouble, and so we're going to ignore this lab result. You figure out, first of all, you have to figure out, is this a true lab result or not? And then you figure out what to do with it. And so I think that AI is not really different in that respect. What we're lacking right now is some of that empirical foundation by which we make those judgments. So if it became apparent that, you know, an imaging algorithm was extremely accurate at detecting certain phenomena, then the problem is that you still need the expert to actually look at that and have it make sense within the patient's own world, within their current environment. The decision making never stops at, is there a diagnosis or is there not? So I don't necessarily see that AI will go unchecked. I think that it's always going to be, you know, embedded in the ethical commitments that clinicians embody.
And we have a follow-up from or clarification from the earlier question related to websites and products for patients. So as I'm understanding it, the question is whether an machine learning framework could be used to evaluate health websites, products for patients in healthcare that are used. So something that's adjacent to the clinical context, or if there would be another framework for that.
That I think, like specifically with respect to the scorecards, I think, you know, most of our work has really kind of focused on the models that are going to have patient impact and justification of their inclusion within the workflow. So my understanding of some of the patient scorecards are a little bit more of an organizational standpoint. And so there's certain models that are going to be likely implemented within administrative data sets, for example. And these are all important. These are all, you know, there's many ways that machine learning can support the workings of a healthcare institution beyond just the, you know, immediate clinical environment. And I don't necessarily know whether a research framework is always going to be the answer for every single one of these models. However, again, when we're talking about the ethical commitments to patients, I really think that that should be our guiding principle as to how we have oversight of machine learning.
Great, thanks. So that was our last question. I want to invite you quickly, if there's any sort of final thoughts, any snapshot that you want to leave us with. Invite you each to chime in if you'd like to leave us with something.
Just to say thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And you can reach out to any of us on Twitter or by email, and we'd be really glad to chat with you.
Can I just say one quick thing, which is maybe a bit self-congratulatory, but I just wanted to say that this process, I think, has been quite a testament both to Beth as the chair of RAB and also to Anna and other ML researchers at SickKids, I think, and to Melissa, obviously. But I think that it's been quite a journey and a hopeful one. I think we started with perhaps some acrimony and have landed, I hope, in a happier place. And I think I just want to say it's a testament to you guys. So, all of you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
echo that. It's been actually quite fun, working with teams that are really keen to move this forward and to have solutions. And I know there was a question about whether we're willing to share. We're absolutely willing to share. I think the templates, that is what we've learned so far. I think that it's, they're all very much living documents. We are learning as much as the teams as we go through this to find the most appropriate ways to do this. But we have absolutely advanced the field and really are excited for the next stages.
Thanks so much, everyone. This is really fantastic work. Really well done. So it's time to draw today's seminar to close. So before we do that, I just have a few announcements I'd like to make. Our next event is the 39th annual Philippa Harris Lecture on Bioethics Issues in Cancer, and it is on Wednesday, November 11th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. So this is a different time than our regular seminar series, so please make note of that. It will be co-presented by the Joint Center for Bioethics and UHN Bioethics. Jonathan Marin from Harvard Center for Bioethics will be discussing ethical issues in cancer care raised during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can sign up to receive the registration link via our weekly seminar reminder. And that's through email at jcb.info@utoronto.ca. For the CSB students who are enrolled in the CSB Student Seminar course, please remember again to keep track of your attendance. And finally, Melissa, James, and Beth, on behalf of all of us, thank you very, very much for your presentation today. Really well done. Thanks.
Thank you so much.